And there's a particular reason that we're doing this today. And that is, there we go. Oh, sorry, I had to copy and paste that text, so it's a little bit terrible. But the reason that we're doing this is because there is an event going on this week, which is the Force for Good, and it's May the 4th be with us. And so, you can read it there, but in a nutshell, it's a grassroots campaign led by neurodivergent students to end this idea of whole body listening in schools. And basically, that's a trend that I think we're moving away from. But whole body listening is something that we still talk about. So, what kind of came up was this neurodivergent young people who said, hey, look, I don't want this to be a thing. I want to advocate for other neurodiverse young people. And so they came up with this really force for good, May the 4th be with us. And of course, using that lovely Star Wars analogy, but there is a link to the petition, but I will also make sure that I include the link to their Facebook page, because other than the petition to sort of change this old way of learning about the whole body listening, it's really advocating for that. So signing the petition, but also they have more resources, and you can kind of hear more about the backstory of this young person who's really driving this change. It's like a force for good. So yeah, that's kind of why I thought this was a really good lunch and learn topic. And I also just want to acknowledge as well, obviously this is very school focused. I think the tricky thing is whenever we talk about making adaptations in the classroom and getting teachers to make all these changes, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that teachers are really overworked. They have so much to do. They're focusing on the emotional, the social, as well as just, the curriculum and the learning of the students. So and I'm very aware that we're asking kind of teachers to do another thing. So on top of just the practical kind of time and energy management for the teachers, quite often there's also those structural barriers. So, if you have a school that is really wonderful at learning adaptions and kind of, embracing these changes for neurodivergent students, that's great. But there's also lots of schools that have that really traditional behavioral method. And so I want to acknowledge that even if you're a teacher that's super enthusiastic and like, great, I want to make all these changes to my classroom, there are some cultural and structural barriers there. So I guess when I wanted to make this presentation, I really wanted to start saying to the teachers, we understand that these things are not easy, that we are, asking you to make all these changes, and that's a big emotional burden, especially some of you might be neurodivergent yourself. So very much this is to help promote this idea to move away from that whole body learning. But what I hope is that you can take these resources and that makes it a little bit easier for you. And of course, as with all our lunch and learns and all our community development and education stuff, we're here to help you. So if you're trying to do some of this stuff and you're thinking, I can't quite work out what they meant by this, or I'm having this problem. The idea of the Lunch and Learns is very much that, yes, we do present this content, but it's available for you to review. But also you can ask us more questions about it. It doesn't just have to be this one learning in time. You can kind of follow up, and we are here to problem solve with you. So again, I want to acknowledge all the wonderful work that teachers already do. And I've seen so many examples of teachers being creative when they don't necessarily have the resources to do that. And we're here to support you in that journey. This is not about saying you need to change the way you practice because it's wrong. It's like, hey, you've been taught this very traditional behavioral model. This is what we've seen works for learning. So let's help you to understand and also be able to make those practical adaptations. So there's my little spiel. But obviously I've thrown the word neurodiversity around quite a bit. So I thought probably good place to start is just a quick reminder of what I'm talking about when I say neurodiverse individuals or use the term neurodiversity. So as you can see from the lovely picture there, when I talk about a neurodivergent individual, basically what we're talking about is an umbrella term. So quite often the most common diagnosis we see under the neurodivergent umbrella is ADHD and autism. But as you can see, there's so much more that kind of comes with it. So if we're looking at school settings, we've got dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, so your learning disabilities. You've also got things like DIDs, I have to say, dissociative identity disorder. We've got, there's lots of other mental health diagnosis in there. So FASD is fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. Basically, when we're talking about neurodivergence, neuro is the brain, divergence, obviously, kind of that difference or divergence outside the norm. And so basically, when we say neurodivergence, what we're talking about is differing from kind of that neurotypical, the way most brains work. So if you've had a student or if you have a young person who has autism or ADHD or any of these neurodivergent diagnoses, what you'll know is, yes, their brain certainly works in different ways. And it's really lovely that we're a society now that's moving towards that acceptance and really helping neurodiverse individuals thrive, because when we've moved away from shoving them in a box that doesn't work and actually facilitating success, there's so much more that they can give to us as a society. And I think it's lovely that we can do that. And this is hopefully going to help schools to let those students thrive and shine in their own ways. So why inclusion matters. 1 in 5 students have a disability and 1 in 7 students are neurodivergent. I actually think that might be a little bit higher, particularly as we get better around diagnosis. And we understand that our current systems are just not built for diverse brains. And again, as a society, we're moving towards more inclusion. We see lots of beautiful like sensory room and quiet spaces coming up in these different areas, particularly in like entertainments like stadiums and things. So I do think we're progressing, but it's still that slow progress. So what I thought I would add in there as well is, I guess, particularly the focus is going to be on sensory processing, because really when we're looking at whole body learning and this movement coming from that particular example, we're really focusing on ways that we can help different individuals understand and learn, and that's really through a sensory framework. I have popped in a bit of language stuff as well, and a tiny bit of social, because of course when young people learn, it's a whole spectrum of all those developmental fields coming together. But because there is that big sensory component when we're talking about whole body listening, I thought it would be a good idea just to touch on what differences a neurodiverse individual might be experiencing. So when we're talking about sensory differences, obviously you've got, your senses that we know, the 5, sight, sound, now I have to say them really quickly, taste, smell, and touch. We also do talk about, oh, here we go. Sorry, I'll just do a little admit there. I think Megan already did it. When we do look at those senses, we also do talk about this. Oh, there's 3 now. There's 3 other senses that we don't see, our internal senses. So one of those is our vestibular sense. So when you're feeling dizzy, it's that sense from the inner ear, kind of tells you where your body is in space if it's moving. Proprioceptive is the feeling from our muscles. So that's, feeling those tight squeezes, the pressure. And then the third one we talk more about, our internal sense, is interoception. So that is the signal that our internal organs send to us. So like hunger, thirst, all that kind of stuff. So that's your big overview of like what the sensory system is. And so then to break it down into what the differences might be, we have these 2 ends of the spectrum, which is hypersensitivity, which is really, really sensitive to all those different bits and pieces, all the different sensory inputs. And then we've got hyposensitivity, which is very much the other end of the spectrum, where they miss those signals. The important thing to understand with neurodiverse individuals, actually with everybody, but I love talking about sensory. I probably will do a whole nother presentation on that. But I guess the really important thing to remember about our sensory systems is everybody has a completely different one. There is no right or wrong. They are spectrums. So even when you're thinking about, neurotypical people, you will have your own preferences. So the other thing to remember is, while some people tend to have a profile of either hyper or hypo, it doesn't always work like that. You might be really sensitive to light, and that might be really difficult, but then you might be really hyposensitive to like touch, like you can't notice as much touch. So what we have is tricky, I think, because we have individuals who are all completely different and they have all these different sensitivities, and some need lots and some need, uh, like they're really sensitive, they need to block things out. So I think that's another thing that's really important to acknowledge teachers is you've got all these kids with lots of different learning needs, and then you've got all these different sensory needs. And I think that's the hard part, is you have to kind of try and meet all those needs. And again, I just want to acknowledge that that is a really big ask. Without going too much further into that sensory stuff, I guess what I would say is that's a really lovely area that occupational therapists can come in and help. So understanding your student's sensory profile. So if particularly parents or teachers or working with a young person, if you see that they have these really strong reactions to sensitivity, around the senses like noise, kind of the ones we talk about most, or you find that they're really seeking, like they're needing a lot of movement or touch or that kind of stuff, that would be a really great time to engage an occupational therapist who will look at that sensory system and then based on that, be able to explain what that young person is feeling, how they understand the input and the environment, the sensory input that comes from that environment, and then what adaptations you can make. So very much when we're looking at sensory systems, and occupational therapists are talking about that, there's no right or wrong in the way people experience the world. It is kind of the way it is. What we want is for people to be able to do the things that they need to and love, in a way that they are comfortable doing. So we know young people, students, they have to go to school. Hopefully they enjoy, but we know that that's something they have to do. And so when we have these sensory sensitivities, it can make them really hard for them to engage. And that's the reason we're talking about whole body listening, is because when these students are not getting their sensory needs met, it can make it really uncomfortable. And when we're uncomfortable, it's really hard for us to learn. So I think as well, the good thing about sensory, and I'm conscious I've probably started going down this track a little bit too much, but we all have sensory needs. And how I explain this as well, often if parents are kind of, having trouble kind of understanding or thinking about it, is, with yourself very much, if you are feeling sick and you're really tired and you can't learn, you're not engaging well, if there is a really frustrating noise going on in the background, if let's say you woke up and you went to work but there was a jackhammer right outside your window, it would be a horrible day and you would probably not be very productive. And you would naturally do strategies to kind of fix that. You would either move offices, you might ask to work from home, you might get some earbuds in. You would naturally do strategies to make yourself more comfortable, and which would help with your work and be more productive. So we know you needed to be regulated in yourself before you're able to be productive. And it's the same with students. So what we have to remember is for these students, even though it might be like a small sound outside, it might feel internally like a jackhammer to them. So what we have to remember is that everybody naturally has these different sensory systems. And as adults, we often make these adaptations for ourselves. We're just helping kids because they're learning. We're helping them to make the adaptations so they can engage and learn. Okie dokie. So again, I've sort of talked a little bit about the barriers that I understand completely that teachers come up against. It's getting better when they're going through uni, but still I think there's lots more education that can happen. As I was just sort of talking about in terms of like regulation needs, there is, and again, whole body listening kind of feeds into this, there is that really behavioral expectation and it's not focusing on regulation. So again, if you're thinking about, the jackhammer example where it's got this jackhammer and you really can't, work, you're going to become stressed, frustrated, you might get a headache, you might have physical symptoms that come about because there's sensory input which is not working for your body. So if you're not able to make those adaptations, if you're not able to move, if you've kind of got it going on, you're going to become very irritable and frustrated. And as well as not being productive, you're probably not going to be really pleasant to be around. And that would be totally understandable. I think if you went home and you were really, really angry and someone said, what happened? And you explained it to them, people would be very empathetic of, oh, my goodness, why couldn't they have let you make these changes to help you. But it's really the same for students as well. If they are having to deal with these huge sensory needs and feeling really, really awful, and they're just trying to do that, they're not going to feel nice and calm. And again, not only is that not going to help for learning, but it's also going to make them really dysregulated. And again, if we're thinking about school, not only is there so much sensory input, but again, it's that emotional toll, it's the social kind of engagement they have to do. School has a lot of demands. And so when you're already in a place where you're quite strained and dysregulated, adding on all those demands, just really, we can see why there might be a huge meltdown, because it's really, really difficult. And we're asking a lot of these students. So definitely, you know, a lot of schools are places where there's sensory overload. Of course there is, kids are running around making noise. That's normal. It's in school. Often it's the sign that they're enjoying themselves in the playground, but there's lots of bright lights, there's changes, there might be big bells, there's lots of people, might be jostling and touching you when you're really sensitive to that. So again, it's all this huge input that, of course, schools do, you know, have just naturally, but we have to kind of think about that. And you can see, sorry, I'd like to use the example myself. I just adjusted. I wasn't comfortable. I had a wiggle. I'm using my hands a lot. Naturally, as adults, we do these things. We click pens. So for kids, it's really normal that these kids with lots of energy and sometimes sensitivities, they need to do these things to engage and listen. The other one, if we're in a meeting and we see someone bouncing their leg, we know that that's just something they're doing to get their body to stay awake and be engaged. I mean, sometimes as well, coffee is a great example. If you need some more sensory input to get yourself to engage, we, grab a coffee, and everyone, that's the social norm. We need that kind of sensory input. So again, if you're struggling and being like, or I suppose if someone's coming to you and saying, why do we need to make these adaptations? You can also refer back to experiences as an adult, and sometimes that helps make the connection. The other thing I'd like to just touch on, and again, this is kind of more a behavioral route, but reward charts and that kind of thing. Now, I understand completely that that's a lot what gets taught. I don't think that, this is certainly not to blame people who start with that reward-based system. It makes a lot of sense. And a lot of kids, especially when we're looking at neurotypical young people, it can work. It can work for them. The problem that we have is that it doesn't necessarily work. So we know from research that neurodiverse individuals don't respond positively or even really respond at all to rewards and kind of systems. It's got a whole bunch of like little reasons that kind of build into that. So firstly, you have to keep it in mind. You have to be able to kind of manage all those impulses. There might be reasons that you can't, follow the rules per se, all these things. And I think as well, I know when I'm talking about neurodiversity, again, focusing more on autism and ADHD, but where I sort of started out my work was kids who had experienced quite a lot of trauma. And what we know for those kids who have experienced trauma is they also do have these really pronounced sensory profiles. So again, either really they miss a lot of input, but then they can be really, really sensitive as well. So when I'm talking about these strategies, definitely there are other kids that will benefit too, and that includes kids who might have experienced some trauma. So the reason I bring that up is because I had this example of a young person, and unfortunately, this teacher, and again, no blame, no shame, they had a reward chart that was like it was an apple, and, the apple was on the tree and then it slowly fell down. Whenever you did something wrong, the apple got further down. And so unfortunately for this young person, because they'd had these experiences of really struggling to engage in the classroom, struggling to follow the rules, because of just what had happened to them, as soon as that apple slipped, the kid was like, well, I'm going down. I might as well go down in flames. And what you're having is this, if you're having a repeated experience, of a young person or anyone not being able to do something, it's kind of that thing, well, if you're going to label me as the bad kid, I might as well be the baddest kid. They kind of just go, there's no hope. I've been trying really hard. And then you completely get this really entrenched problem. And unfortunately, in apples, because the kid was like, well, I'm a bad apple. And I was like, no, you're not. So again, it's like that changing the way we do things. And I think as well, the problem with those behavior charts when they're right up there is all the kids can see, and you also get that shame and blame. So again, if you're not feeling great about yourself, you're not going to be regulated, and then you're not going to be able to learn. So that's a longer conversation as well about what we can do to help implement other strategies, and that's again where an OT might be able to come in and assist. Lots of talking. Okie dokie. So I'm going to do this. I was just saying, every time I use PowerPoint, I feel like an old lady because I can never get it to work. Okay. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we're doing Teams sharing. So whilst I can mostly get this video to work, I do appreciate it might be a little bit clunky. So I'll do my best. I'll show the video. It's about school exclusion with disadvantaged students. So, and again, this is focusing on kind of disadvantage as a whole. But I'll put the link in there because I acknowledge sometimes the sound's a little bit awkward on Teams and things like that. All right, now I'm going to do come back, share sound. All right, and Megan will pipe in if it's not working.
How Nash Clark remembers feeling in primary school.
It felt like my mum was not knowingly giving me away to a prison, putting me behind bars.
The now 14-year-old autism advocate dreams of working with trains, but he's got a tough course ahead after leaving school when he was 10. Nash remembers feeling distressed. He felt isolated from his peers and left out of schoolwork at his Adelaide Catholic primary school.
The other option I had, other than picking him up, was to stay in a sick room, which was a really small space, probably the size of an average bathroom.
Nash's mother, Paula Kirk-Clark, now runs a weekly community group for families facing similar situations. She says she sees children of all ages with complex needs who have been suspended or otherwise excluded across the public and private school sectors, some as recent as this term.
They're broken, there's no support, there's no financial support for mums who leave the workforce like myself.
New research from Adelaide shows students with disabilities, First Nations children, and those from lower socioeconomic groups are disproportionately suspended or otherwise excluded.
In the US, they call it the school to prison pipeline. It's pretty clear that that doesn't work as a punishment for that child in terms of trying to fix that behaviour. What it does is exacerbate their circumstances.
Data released by the SA government shows suspensions have risen by about 10% across public schools between 2018 and 2022. SA's Education Union says teachers are stretched for resources and can't meet student needs.
There's a lot of disability and complexity in cohorts of students at the moment. They need increases in support to be able to manage those.
The South Australian government is focusing on measures to reduce suspensions. It's announced autism inclusion teachers for every public primary school and increased the number of mental health and learning specialists at state schools. Catholic Education SA says it's refining its approach to supporting students with disabilities, including through specialist expertise. It's also encouraging parents to discuss options with principals. But researchers say what's needed is an overhaul of education laws and policies, which they say encourage schools to exclude children. Meanwhile, Nash is helping other children experiencing similar isolation.
We aim to help these kids not go through what I went through, because I don't want any more kids to go through this.
A light at the end of the tunnel to give other kids a chance. Anisha Pilarisetti, ABC News.
Okie dokie. So I'm just going to get that. So yeah, I think as well, when we talk about neuro diverse, kind of making these adaptations. Oh, sorry, I wanted to just get it on the side and now I've completely reshared my screen. That's all right. That's a nice kind of break from heavy content. When we're talking about this stuff, what's one of the really important thing when we talk about neurodiverse affirming kind of practice, as we say, or kind of making these adaptations, is the importance of autistic voices, or making sure those neurodiverse voices are able to contribute. And I think that's also what's really helped with this particular movement against that whole body learning, is that we've had these wonderful, particularly autistic voices come out and say, this doesn't work for us, this is not quite what we need, we're not getting the most out of our education, and they're able to say, this is kind of more how we would like to learn and this is what would help us. And I think that's really wonderful. And I think the most important thing is, if people are out there advocating for themselves, that we listen. And yes, there are 100% barriers. There are lots of difficulties, as they kind of discussed there. The education system isn't necessarily set up to make this easy for teachers. But again, I think as a community and people who work with, young people, it's really important that we do try and problem solve and kind of continue that advocacy work. Now I'm going to see if I can make this so you can still see me. Megan thought people might like to see me while I talk. I'm not convinced that's all right. I'll just continue on then. All right, so I guess I don't want to harp on too much what not to do. We'll kind of move to the more positive section soon. So yeah, I guess what we want to move away from that whole body learning is really, that people have to do things like stimming. So, hyperfocus is wrong. We don't expect people to mask, because that can be really detrimental for young people. It's not this kind of really rigid routines, and we're not using that negative punishment. Weird behavior there. So it's really kind of helping students embrace their strengths. And I guess there was a really lovely example that a young person was talking to me about, which was learning and not fidgeting, and kind of we were talking about sort of one of the strategies we have is the wobble cushion. And I'll talk a little bit more about strategy soon. But I said, why didn't you grab your wobble cushion? They said, one of the barriers, I didn't want to stand out. And I was like, yeah, I do understand that. I said, well, what did you do? And they said, I spent the whole lesson going, don't fidget, don't move, don't move. And I said, did you have any idea what was going on? They said, no, I didn't learn anything. I was just focusing so hard on not moving. And that's really, I think, such a great example of like where this whole body listening, where you're sitting still and looking, it actually takes away from the learning. Ooh, come on, move over. As I said, obviously we've talked a lot about the sensory needs, but I do just want to touch on as well speech and language differences that are also important to think about when we're looking at how we can change the way that we engage neurodiverse individuals. Obviously not a speech and language pathologist, so this is the absolute bare minimum. I'm sure there are lots of speechies who could talk and do their own lunch and learn about this. But I guess it's that thing around just being aware that firstly, everyone has different communication strategies. But when we're thinking particularly about whole body learning and that, like, eyes on me and ears listening, sometimes because there are these speech and language difficulties, like doing the eye contact and the listening, it can be really difficult. Like sometimes, people need to look down so they don't have visual distractions, so they can focus on just that listening. It can help. And, when we're thinking about, if you're focusing, sorry, my brain's now not working. If you're trying to listen to something and you're trying to listen really, really intensely, you might sort of put your head down, lean in a bit closer. And so again, if we're thinking about how we can help students, if there is this huge task of like listening and understanding, it makes sense that they might need to, listen in a different way. And I think there as well, I've just included, there are some language differences, like they might have difficulty with pragmatics. It's not about a deficit, understanding what you're saying. Obviously, if they're taking things literally, you might need to be aware of that. Interpreting, processing speed as well. Like sometimes it just, they might understand the message. It just might take a little bit longer for them to decode. And I think that's really important as well. If you're thinking in a classroom, if you've given some instructions that are right, off you go, if a student's still kind of processing that, and then all of a sudden there's this huge movement and they're like, oh gosh, what have I got to do? I think it's really important to remember and keep in mind there might be that difference in communication, and that young person might not have been like, they might have been daydreaming, but they might not be daydreaming. It might be just that they're sitting there going, oh, wait, hang on, I was just thinking that through. What's the next step? And so you need to just be like, oh, okay, let them kind of look like they're finishing their thought. And that's when you can go over and do some different strategies. And I think, again, this is a speech language thing. And, this is where you engage with the speech therapist and occupational therapist. When you're looking at speech and language differences, I guess there's a very different way a student might interpret if you go over and you're kind of, again, sometimes they have trouble with reading tone and things like that. If these students are getting in trouble a lot, sometimes they can be like, oh my gosh, what am I in trouble for? If you go, what are you doing? Even if someone's going, oh, do you know what you're doing? They might interpret that as like oh my goodness, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to. And then they might freeze and then they'll completely not remember what they're doing. And obviously that can then lead into a bit of a cycle of either shame or them seeming like they were distracted in that moment or they weren't listening. So I guess, again, it's the kind of, when we talk about language, not those big kind of general, like, what are you doing? Or like, do you know what to do next? It's going over and going, okay, did you get all what I was saying through? Did that make sense? And being like, okay, do you know what the next instruction is? And, being like, or do you need any help with the next instruction? They might be like, I don't know what to do next. You can be like, okay, well, this is what we're doing. We're doing this, 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 and this. Trying to keep it short, succinct, and very much just dot points. But the other thing, obviously, that we really are very much about is like visual supports. Because, again, holding that information, you've got to listen, process. If you're talking about learning content, the student was hopefully focused on learning that content and just processing that. And then all of a sudden you had an instruction come out. And so what we want is for them to have focused on that content. And then the instruction is great. But if you can kind of give them to that in a visual support, maybe jot those notes up on the board, it means that they have time to digest that content and then still be able to follow the next direction. So very much it's important to think about, again, what is the purpose? Like, what are we wanting the students to do? And often it is to learn and, engage and enjoy school. So if we can help support them to do the things that they want to, they're going to have much better time at school. So very much, co-regulation, patience, just kind of, I guess, making those adaptations. So, as I said, get on to the nice bit, which is neurodiverse affirming practices. So I've got a bit more than just this. I've got a few little resources because I think that helps in terms of when you go away from these presentations and there's lots of information. This has been very content heavy. It's nice to have some resources to look back on and go, what is she talking about that? And then being able to implement those. So I've got a list coming up so you don't feel completely overwhelmed, hopefully. But yeah, obviously what we're talking about, again, with whole body listening is we're looking at the different things that we can do to help the student engage. And if we're looking at, actually, I might flip to, oh, that's more about the social stuff. Actually, sorry, I do apologize. I was doing this. I thought I did such a great job of putting my slides in order. What I'm going to do is do one more little, I guess, content piece that I'd like you to learn about differences, and then I'll go back and talk more about practical strategies. Apologies. So what I was hoping is, based on my information there on different learning strategies, I just wanted to flag something else which is really important, and I guess maybe is a deviation off the whole body learning, but it's something that I really like to talk to, because, again, if we're looking at learners and supporting young people to engage in school and then, hopefully the workforce in the end, we need to understand that they have differences in learning, and that includes social learning. So I just wanted to throw in this, the double empathy problem, because I think this is something that comes up particularly for students when they're at school. So this is a beautiful illustration done by NeuroWild, who I've referenced a bit in this presentation. And oh no, it's so squishy, sorry. That's okay, I can kind of read bits of it. sorry, I've just got to move my taskbar out of there. The link is there again. But basically what they're talking about is, oh no. Uh, yeah, sorry, I just had to read it and I was like, oh gosh, I can't read it. Yeah, this is the other problem. Think about text, think about how things are visually presented and not like this. But sorry, so the double empathy problem is really what traditionally we used to say, or people used to say, is that autistic individuals don't have empathy, or they don't show empathy. And what we know is that's actually not true. It's just that they show empathy in a different way. So for example, squirrels have no problem communicating and making friends with other squirrels. So when they're around them, they talk about the things that they're good at, they kind of understand. So beavers, on the other hand, have no problem communicating and making friends with other beavers. They're just chatting, they understand. But squirrels and beavers, when they try to communicate, sometimes that miscommunication can occur. And whose fault is it? Who's responsible for fixing that problem? So curiously, society decided that it was only the squirrel's job to repair that communication. So, oh my gosh, all these little things that we're saying, don't look at the communication barriers. So, when we're looking at this example, how strange, does anyone else feel like there's a mistake? Yes, there is. How do we sort it out? Recognize that autistic people have their own communication style. Miscommunication occurs because of mismatched communication, not because autistic people have delayed or disordered skills. So again, we can experience that speech and language. There is sometimes that difficulty, but also there's just different ways of communicating. And I think that's really important when we're looking at making adaptations for neurodiverse individuals, is that there's lots of different communication. And so we need to give a variety of ways, really clear instructions. So this is going on about social skills, obviously, but stop teaching autistic kids social skills. They don't need to learn how to be beavers. Teach all kids about communication, be kind, and learn about how communication occurs, and ensure neurodivergent kids have opportunities to hang out with other neurodivergent kids, because we often find that, there is that kind of squirrel language, if you like, because, they often get each other. So it's about that kind of normalizing that everyone does have a different communication strategy and really embracing that. And that, again, with that neurodivergent approach and kind of whole learn approach, is really important. And that very much the reason I like the double empathy problem, talking about it, is because when we're looking at making these adaptations, obviously the young people who neurodivergent young people, they benefit. But I think as well, it's a really good opportunity to talk to all of class members about the different ways of learning. And again, that's not something that's a totally new concept. Quite often they talk about, how do you learn? Are you a practical learner? Are you a visual learner? That's something that people have been talking about for a while. I think this really empowers all the students to think about how they learn. How is the best way you learn? What environment do you learn in? And this is really good because, again, if we're thinking about what we want kids to get out of school, we want them to be lifelong learners. And that includes understanding how they learn, but also those skills. If I'm in the workplace and that's not how it works for me, what adaptations can I make? Is it okay that I have these differences? Absolutely. It's really normal. Understanding, how do I advocate for myself if there's a way I'm not understanding information? How do I go about finding out more, asking for help? What we're doing is really getting kids to understand their own strengths and difficulties, and then creating an environment where they can go and learn those lifelong skills of advocating and helping themselves to be able to engage in, leisure, sport, kind of, social settings, future learning workplaces. You're setting them up for life. So again, I'll go through a bigger list, but practical, changes that you can make tomorrow, very much about reframing behaviors as communication. I think I have this, but in a future slide as well. But there is, if you haven't seen Ross Green, his work is really fantastic. I will find out the book name and put it in because it escapes me, because he has a couple. But what he really looks at is that behavior is a communication. And I think, again, when we think of kids, that really makes sense. Kids do well when they can. We know kids want to do well. No kid really wants to be in trouble. It certainly doesn't start out that way. So when something is happening for a young person, we're looking at that and we're like, okay, why is that happening? And again, if we're thinking about that whole body listing, like, why are they fidgeting and not looking at me? It's like, okay, well, why are they? Is it that they're they do need a movement break, you know. Is it better for them to look at the floor? Are they overstimulated? Have they just had information overload? You know, if they're having a big meltdown, what has led to that? What has happened in their day for them to be, you know, completely having this, like, you know, outburst? Or if they're completely disengaged, the opposite, if they're kind of like shut down, what happened to them? At what point did the kind of everything get too much? So when we're looking at these behaviors, we need to remember that it's a communication, and we really need to understand it's supporting a young person and their needs to help meet those needs so then they can engage in learning. So again, I know this is hard in school, but create opt-in participation. So when you're looking at content and learning, having different kind of ways of engaging is really helpful. So, you know, there are some kids who really love to put their hand up and contribute, but there are also kids who find that really difficult. And I think if you are looking at things like, you know, everyone has to participate, what does participation look like? Because if a child is anxious and doesn't like talking in front of the class, does that mean they haven't understood the concept? You know, can you check the learning a different way? Is it that they have to put up their hand and participate, or is there a different way? You know, can you go have a one-on-one conversation with them? There's, you know, think about what the goal is and then how you can look at kind of having them participate in those different ways. And I think as well, you know, once you understand someone's strengths and interests, you can really see them shine. I think, you know, no surprise to anyone, when you are able to understand or really enjoy a topic at school or include your interest in it, it was a very different experience. You see that motivation go up. So again, when you're looking at young people and how to engage them, sometimes it is, can you weave an interest in there? You know, can you even like just engage with them and talk to them about it and show that you are interested in them and kind of what they've got to say? So again, really basic stuff like use predictable routines and prepare for transitions. With school, we know there are lots of transitions, and of course, there are things that happen which are unpredictable. That's part of it. But when can we prepare a young person for that? You know, what can we do to make that a more inclusive thing for them? So I'm just going to see what I've got. Oh, look at that. I've got another slide with so much. I don't think this one's quite as bad. But again, this is a really beautiful one from NeuroWild. There's 2 slides to this. And again, this is a really wonderful if you are working in an educational setting. NeuroWild has lots of really beautiful resources. And I love this one for classrooms because it talks directly to the young people. So in our class, we're all different. We each have different bodies, a different brain, a different personality. Others might be similar to you. They might like the same thing or they might look like you, but no one is exactly you. You're one of a kind. So in our class, we have different learners. I learn best when I can wriggle and use my deep interest. So interest for them. We learn best when we can keep our hands busy. I learn best when I can move around and talk about what I'm learning. In our class, we each need different things to keep us happy and comfortable. So I wear headphones because I hear every sound, so that real sensitivity hurts my ears and makes me really stressed. Sometimes I'm not sure what my body is feeling. This can be confusing, but there are things I can do usually make me better. I like to move my arms. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, the stimming, that's a flapping. And again, it's allowing students to do that because when we used to force autistic individuals particularly to hold in this stim, it just made them uncomfortable and they couldn't concentrate and engage. So, you know, allowing that to happen. We all communicate differently. When I talk to someone, I don't look at their eyes because it makes it too hard to listen. So again, if you're asking for students to like make eye contact with you, you might be doing that at the detriment of their learning. So I often talk quickly, I understand that, in a loud voice. I love talking to everyone, even if I don't know them well. We have different interests. I love to run and climb. I love to organize. I love to explore space. I'm great at gaming. So all play is okay. Everyone can play in a different way, and that's, you know, totally valid. And I think, again, when you're thinking about schools, kids like different things. You got the kid who sometimes likes to go to the library and sit quietly, or you've got the kid who likes to run around and be really loud on the playground. They are both completely valid. And I think it's really important when we're looking at having young people regulated, that we allow them to play in a way that is helpful. And play is really important for learning. And so I think it's really important that we embrace that. So in our class, we have different things we find hard. So, if I lose a game, that's hard. If I find writing stories really difficult, one's maths, one's help around, schoolwork, I get distracted. So again, it's also understanding and empowering students to be like, yeah, everyone has difficulties. That's okay. And again, one of those strategies I really want to advocate for is that modeling. So we do this quite often in therapy sessions. We often use different things that highlight our difficulties. For example, I'm not very good at sport, and I embrace that fully, and I talk to kids about that. And then I have to think of things I'm good at. So they go, oh, what are you good at? And I'm like, craft. But I'm not very good at sport, and that's okay. And I talk to kids about that. I'm like, yeah. And I hated sport as a kid as well, like at PE, miserable, absolutely hated it. So, I think we all have experience of that where there were things that we didn't like in school, and definitely that led to less engagement. So yeah, empowering kids to have that conversation. Click on to the next one. No, there we go. In our class, we do our best to look after each other. So it's loud in here. We'll get your headphones. Again, really normalizing that it's okay for everyone to kind of know and help each other. And in our class, we're different, and that's what makes us special. We haven't all done that though, whether we know our brain type or whether we know our brain type or not. It's a good idea for all of us to practice listening to our body. So again, understanding what our body needs. And think about things that make us feel happy and calm and comfortable. Remember that everyone has different brains. If something feels uncomfortable or unsafe to you, it's your job it's not your job to deal with it or pretend everything's okay. Talk to your safe adults when you feel uncomfortable or unsafe. And again, that's something we want kids to do. If they're feeling uncomfortable, a huge part of working with young people is helping them say, hey, yeah, go to a safe adult and talk about this. And that is across all experiences with kids' bodies. And that includes when they're uncomfortable with their sensory environment as well. So in our class, some kids have spent time with psychologists or OTs to help work out what type of brain they have. And knowing this does help. But I think as well, I like on that point, we know that there's also, and I talk about this a little bit with neurodiverse affirming practice, sometimes a diagnosis is a bit of a privilege. It is still, there's lots of barriers to diagnosis. It is expensive, there's wait lists. So sometimes people might not have a label. And that's really why I like this whole inclusive process, because again, everyone is different. Everyone has different sensory needs. Everyone learns differently. And so just because someone might not come with a label that helps us understand the way their brain works, doesn't mean we can't do these practices to help everybody and really understand what they need. And again, I'll send the link to this, but there's this really lovely worksheet that comes out with this resource. And that's a really nice way to use this resource to talk to students about their learning and what they need in the classroom. Another really beautiful resource is from Autism Level Up. And again, if you're looking at this difference in, moving from whole body learning to something different, it's Bump at the Whole Body Learner, and there's a whole resource that goes with this for teachers, and it's really good. I've put the link in, so I definitely encourage you to look at the whole package. But yeah, looking at the different ways of communicating and tactile manipulators and, parts of your body and kind of what we're feeling. So how do you look like when you're learning? So again, it's a whole resource. I've put the link in so you can go have a look at that, because there is a whole lot of information that goes with that. But again, it's looking at this really nice idea of shifting from, like whole body listening to being a whole body learner. And we know that kids do well when we can give them learning with different sensory inputs. And so we shouldn't then, I guess, pigeonhole them into just listening in one way. So this kind of touched on as well, there's the Ross Green. So kids do well when they can. So we need to make sure that first of all, kids are regulated, and then we can help them learn. So what we need to be aware of is when we're looking at, the taskbar keeps getting in the way of me. When we're looking at, moving away from that whole body listening, not rewarding that, and not kind of as well, not pointing out when kids can't do like, traditional whole body listening, like quiet hands. It's like, when we reward behavior that is like physically uncomfortable for the young person, that's really hard. It's kind of teaching them, I guess, that they can't be themselves, or they can't listen to their body, which is definitely not what we want young people to learn. And again, when we're forcing them to do this particular way of listening, the risk is that we might have them behave in the way that, you know, we think is correct for whole body listening. But they might not be listening, you know, they can't hear what's going on. They're not actually engaged in the content. They're just sitting there potentially focusing on not moving. And that is really, really difficult. And again, when we think about the purpose of schooling, that's not what we want. Oh, we've got another video. So I'm going to very wonderfully go to my next video. I do also understand as well, we're probably going to run a little bit over because we started a little bit later. So if you do have to duck out, that's absolutely fine, but we'll keep recording so we can put this up as well. Alrighty, I am going to, and again, sorry, harped on about it. I'm like a broken record in a good way, I'm sure. These are adaptions that we're talking about for school. However, adaptions everywhere, including the work environment, can really help people thrive. Now I'm going to play this and hopefully it'll work.
At 25, Anthony Porter is a lead data analyst. He's working on one of many big data government contracts. Before it, he was on the disability support pension.
I was having a lot of struggles with mental health, specifically my anxiety. I could rarely ever leave the house and I had trouble communicating with people, and it really wasn't possible for me to work.
Anthony got the job as a junior data analyst, and honestly, from day one he has thrived. It is unbelievable to watch him not only come to work each day, but start to exercise, ride his bicycle, start to make friends and relationships.
I love helping people and helping people with similar struggles that I've had, and helping them develop technically and personally has been a really great part of my job.
Oh, that's a fun part of it after. Oh gosh, please.
Wix, one platform, any website.
My strength is not computers. Okay, so yeah, I thought I'd throw in a little nice one there too, video about what goes well. And now I have to do the old lady thing where I get completely bamboozled by PowerPoint. Right, I will go through these resources in a second. I can never tell how long I'm going to talk for. It's always a bit of a gamble. I've just had this thing come up on the side of my video. I hope my head hasn't been completely blocking all my slides for this. But I'll put the slides up everywhere else soon. That completely threw me off my group. So yeah, there's lots of resources now, not only for schools, but for workplaces. I was going to actually just copy some of these things, and I thought, well, if I'm just going to copy and paste them and reference them, I might as well show you them. And like I said, this has been a pretty, it's not going to do it. Yeah. This has been a pretty content heavy presentation. So I thought, well, at least if I give you some good resources, you can go away and look at them in your own time. And like I said, please remember that we are here to help you. So if you come across something and you either don't know how to implement it, or you try and it doesn't quite work, or you want to ask questions, that's what we're here for. Again, Lunch and Learn is about ongoing learning. So like the students, it's okay if you need to process things and come back later. So again, so this is my favorite one at the top. There is this giant chunk of information, which I did find a little bit overwhelming, but then I liked that it kind of did some nice dot points. See, everyone learns differently. So chunking information and visual aids. So I sort of touched on this, but again, it's very much about providing visual aids because sometimes that's really nice to kind of have another reminder of what's going on. Visual timetables can help young people and adults think about what's coming up for the day, helps them know maybe if we're talking about, students having to keep all the information in their head, that doesn't really help when we're learning. So by having a visual timetable, a young person's not trying to remember what's the next class or things like that. That has freed up their space to be able to learn, and they can just look at that visual timetable and go, oh yeah. It also helps as well if you're looking at a young person who really struggles with sudden changes, because it means that you can actually visually be like, hey, I know we normally have library in this time. Today we've got assembly. So you wanting them, but is there something that you need to make that more comfortable? Because again, actually, I use the example of assembly because that is the number one kind of tricky school activity that comes up, that in sports days. But assembly is really difficult. You've got to sit quietly and still in something that can be really loud and comfortable, and you can't fidget, and it has just been a nightmare for a lot of my young people. So if they don't have to go to assembly a lot of the time, that might be helpful. But if they do, it's, we've also helped make adaptations at school. So is it headphones, to block out the noise? Is it that they can kind of come a little bit later and just sneak in the back and sit if they have to participate, where they're away from other students that might be bumping them or talking and whispering? Can they engage that way? Maybe with the teachers where they can sit quietly and just kind of, where they can maybe fidget. If this is something that I think I wanted to touch on, when we're looking at the sensory needs of students. The other tricky thing is, again, if you've got a student who's really distracted by one thing and another student needs to fidget with that thing, how do you balance that? And so that is definitely a difficulty. So for example, in here, if a kid needs to like fidget and then other kids are getting distracted by them, that's not meeting everyone's sensory needs. So it's like, okay, if we know they need to fidget, can we move them to a space where they can fidget? Or can they sit on the end of the aisle and go for a walk and come back if they need to? If we're looking at like fidgets in the classroom, certainly I've had to help young people find ones that don't make clicking noises, because we don't want everyone to be, they sometimes don't want kids to be looking at them, but we don't want them to be distracting. I think, there's this idea that if we're making all these adaptations, then we're expecting, everyone to just make them and make everything the way that this young person wants or whatever. And it's like, no, we acknowledge, I think, you need to think about everybody, and you need to teach young people the skills to be able to use these tools in a way that still allows them to engage and allows everybody else to engage. And so, yes, they need a fidget, but also it makes sense that they might need a fidget that's quiet. And again, on that kind of thing about students sometimes not wanting to stand out, there are ways that we can change that. So they might not want to hold a fidget, but maybe we can put like some Velcro dots under their desk and no one needs to see that. And then they can play with those under their desk. Or they might not like a wobble cushion because it might stand out. But we can put like a kick band, like some elastic around their chair, and they can kind of use that to get some feedback on their legs. So again, think of the needs of the classroom and the student and everyone else. And it's like, okay, again, this is where occupational therapists shine. It's like, okay, how do we meet that need in a way that suits that environment? And again, sometimes that is creative problem solving, but where there's a will, there's a way. We have lots of tools. So again, just onto the visual stuff, to go back to that, color coding, nice clear chunks. Sometimes it's really difficult because it's this balance between classrooms being really bright and colorful and having lots of beautiful artwork, and then that being visually stimulating. But I understand that people don't want classrooms to look cold and clinical. So again, it's finding that kind of middle ground. So, if we want to put out all the beautiful artwork, can we put it behind the student? Can we move that student forward? And then when we have the whiteboard, can we just have the information on it and just like some outlines or chunks? This is what we're looking at today. So again, it's like, okay, we know that there's lots of different needs for people. How can we help make those adaptations for everybody? So there's that. Body and brain breaks. We're pretty good at this now. Lots of schools, they understand they need to get up and move. Again, there's lots of things that OTs can contribute around thinking about what kind of movement breaks might work for someone. We talk a lot about like heavy work activities, and I can add some more strategies around that because I've got quite a few of like how we can kind of sneak that into a student's day. Sensory friendly stuff. There's some really lovely kind of bits and pieces. Obviously focusing mostly on autism today, but we do see this overlap with dyslexia and other learning disabilities. So I think that's probably a little bit in terms of specific for time today, but certainly there are lots of really wonderful resources. I'll try and remember to add that as well. But there's different ways of learning. And I guess the other thing to think about is, we're using technology so much. Can we use voice to text? Like if it's the difference between a young person engaging and not engaging and just missing on all the content, how can we present that differently? Can we present, auditory stuff. Can we let them use voice to text? What are the different things we can do? And I understand people are like, oh, what about handwriting and all this kind of stuff? It's like, well, if they're having such a hard time with this, that then they're completely disengaged, doesn't matter that you're worried about them like learning the handwriting and writing skill. If they're not doing it, if they're completely disengaged and feel terrible about themselves, they're not going to learn anyway. So it's like, again, what is the goal? What is the purpose of this? And yes, sometimes we might have to get them to write, but again, how do we set them up for success? Is it this one task that we do? Can we give them extra time? Can we give them like a pencil grip and a slant board? What adaptations can we make? Because again, I think it's like we do realize that sometimes these things have to happen. So let's make it as comfortable as possible. Okie dokie. So as I said, I've included a whole bunch of those ones. And of course, I can never remember what the other one was that I wanted. This one. There's so many. There's just wonderful. There is like a bit of repetition between them. But again, I've included them all because I couldn't choose. So I suppose, lots of really wonderful, wonderful resources there. And lots of really good, I think, in terms of I've tried to get a variety. So some are like more kind of academic, like the Childmind Institute, but then there's also things that are available from teachers, and you can kind of have a look a little bit more. There's therapists and things like that, and autism awareness. So I'm trying to get a variety of those, and you can go through them, like I said. And if something doesn't make sense or you need support in implementing it, please let us know. So I guess in summing up, if I can get it to work, I don't know if you can see, I have this little taskbar, and every time I try to do something, it gets right square in the way. I'm sure we can all see this current slide anyway. So to sum up, I guess it's about making sure that we adapt it to students. And again, there is lots of those examples. So, again, changing the way that the classroom looks for the student. Can you move the student? Is it visually distracting? Some kids don't do well sitting next to a window because it's too loud and distracting. So think about the different ways that, a child that might be sensitive to, let's say, sight and moving around. How can we change that around for them? Can we give them a space that's a little bit calmer and modern? We've seen a lot of with headphones, sound is a big one. Schools are really noisy. So, can we let them have those? There's loops now, which are really tiny, a little bit more subtle for those kids that don't want to wear them. That's how do they learn? How do they like listen and engage? If we're looking at that whole body learning, it might be if everybody's sitting and talking on the, listening, they just might not get that information, and you might just have to go one-on-one with them. So it's like, okay, maybe they don't listen in that particular moment because it's too hard for them, and maybe they're just like doodling, drawing, and you go and then talk to them one-on-one. Or maybe the doodling is how they engage and listen, and they have that in their brain going. The other like very OT sensory adaptions that's up there is like the chewy necklaces. So chewing is a fantastic sensory input. People often, kids, you'll get them chewing on their pencils. So chewy can help them concentrate. It's a deep pressure, but it's nice because it's a little bit more subtle sometimes, and they're going to chew on their pencils anyway. Oh, the other one they do is chew on their uniforms. This is a nice kind of adaptation for them. But as well, you can think about like water bottles are fantastic. I know that sounds weird, but having kids access to water, it gives them a nice natural movement break. Do I need to get up and drink my water? Gives me the movement, helps keep regulated, because one of the fantastic reasons that I always talk about drinking water, as weird as that is because when you're drinking, it regulates your breathing. So again, sometimes if you're telling kids to do their breathing, they're not going to have a bar of it. But if you go, okay, go get a drink of water, it's something really normal and natural for us to do, to have a break and drink some water, but it will help that breathing naturally. And again, if you've got like a straw or something like that, and it's again, that real sucking is kind of that sensory input, and it's calming. So again, you're thinking about these things which can really help in terms of adaptations. I'm just going through all my little other, the other one that comes up a lot, I'm very conscious of the time, but uniforms. oh, uniforms are so scratchy and uncomfortable. I completely get it. Can we help make adaptations to the uniforms? Because again, you know yourself, if you are sitting in an uncomfortable piece of clothing, if it's digging in, if you've got a scratchy label, if it's a scratchy, itchy wool jumper, it's going to make you grumpy and dysregulated and really have a hard time learning. So think again, if this is a, when your socks stuck the wrong way, you just feel grumpy. So how can we help kids? So yes, I understand completely there are uniform policies, but what can we do to help kind of, have them wear as close as they need to, but maybe have different adaptations? I also tell parents a lot, secondhand uniforms are great because they've been worn in usually, and so they're a bit more comfy. So I'm thinking so to touch, taste. Yep. So I think that's most of my generic strategies that I've hit. Yeah, I will, like I said, those websites, I was just reinventing the wheel basically. They've got so many fantastic ones. Neurowild has lots of really great resources, as does Autism Level Up, which is where that little robot poster came from. So I really felt like I was just repeating things. But like I said, everyone is different and all learning styles are valid, as it says there. So whilst these are some wonderful generic kind of things that you can do to help your classroom and help kids learn in their own way, please talk to us or another OT or whoever is in, the child support system about how we can make this individualized to them. And again, completely acknowledging that every school environment is different, like literally physically, but also that culture of the school. So we can help you find the best adaptation to meet the sensory needs that is appropriate in that environment. And again, I want to say to the teachers, the work you do is amazing. I see so many teachers going above and beyond. So the idea with this presentation is really just to help give you the shortcut to the solutions to make, your classroom and your job easier as well. What I will do is get Megan to stop the recording because I don't know how to do that. And then if there's any questions, I'm happy to stick around for that.